Hello, everyone. Tonight, we are stepping back into a time of muskets, cannons, and grand ambitions, a period when a single diminutive figure cast a colossal shadow across an entire continent. Imagine yourself standing on a windswept European plain, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the distant shouts of tens of thousands of soldiers. Cannons roar cavalry charges, and the fate of empires hangs in the balance with every volley. This isn't a game. This is history, raw and unforgiving, and you probably won't survive this without understanding the forces that shaped it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing amidst the swirling chaos of late 18th century Paris, the air thick not with gunpowder yet, but with revolutionary fervor. The year is 1793, and the Geek French Revolution to sus is devouring its own a bloody maelstrom that has overthrown a monarchy and sent shockwaves across Europe. Imagine the cobblestone streets once witness to powdered wigs and gilded carriages now echoing with the shouts of angry mobs and the ominous creak of the guillotine. This isn't just political upheaval. It's a societal earthquake tearing down centuries of tradition and privilege. You can almost feel the nervous energy, the simmering fear, and the exhilarating, terrifying sense that anything is possible. Before Napoleon could stride onto the European stage, the stage itself had to be violently cleared. The execution of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette in 1793 sent a clear message: the old order was dead. This act plunged France into a period of radical change, external wars, and internal purges, known as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety sought to eradicate all perceived enemies of the revolution, leading to mass executions. It's like a nation collectively hitting the reset button, but with a very, very sharp axe. This extreme internal pressure, however, also forged a formidable new army driven by patriotic zeal and the very real threat of foreign invasion. The surrounding European monarchies, terrified that revolutionary ideas might infect their own populations, formed coalitions to crush the French Republic. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and others declared war, hoping to restore the Bourbon monarchy. This external threat paradoxically strengthened the revolutionary government's resolve and militarized French society. Everyone, it seemed, had a role to play in defending the new republic. One authoritative historical fact is that by 1793, France was at war with most of Europe, necessitating mass conscription and fostering a highly militarized society. This era was a fascinating mix of idealism and brutality. On one hand, you had soaring declarations of human rights and liberty. On the other, you had widespread paranoia and summary executions. Historians still debate whether the Reign of Terror was a necessary evil to protect the nascent republic from internal and external enemies, or an excessive and tragic deviation from the revolution's core ideals. It's like wondering if you need to break a few eggs to make an omelet, but the eggs are people, and the omelet is a new form of government. Amidst this turmoil, a young artillery officer largely unknown was quietly observing, learning, and seeing opportunities. The traditional aristocratic officer corps had been decimated by emigration, and the guillotine leaving a power vacuum and a desperate need for talented military leaders. This was fertile ground for someone with ambition and skill, someone who didn't come from the old noble families. A quirky fact during the Directory period after the Reign of Terror fashion swung wildly from austere revolutionary garb to exaggerated, almost ridiculous styles, with men wearing impossibly high cravats and women adopting revealing Grecian dresses, perhaps as a way to forget the recent horrors. It's a bit like historical whiplash, isn't it? The chaos of the French Revolution, therefore, wasn't just a prelude to Napoleon. It was the forge in which he was tempered, shaping his worldview, his tactics, and his unshakable belief in order born from chaos. You've just witnessed the crucible of the French Revolution, a chaotic forge, perfect for shaping a determined individual. Now let's zoom in on the man himself, a figure whose very name evokes an era, Napoleon Bonaparte. Imagine a young, ambitious Corsican not born into the glittering aristocracy, but into a family of minor nobility on an island newly acquired by France. His origins were humble enough to be relatable, yet just elevated enough to grant him access to opportunities denied to commoners. This dual background would shape his worldview, making him both an outsider and a driven participant in the grand drama of European politics. Napoleon was born in Ajaccio, Corsica, on August 15, 1769, just a year after France gained control of the island from Genoa. His native language was Corsican, and he only learned French later with a distinct accent that he never truly lost. You can picture him as a somewhat awkward, intensely intelligent young man, perhaps a bit of an outsider among his more established French peers. His family, though not wealthy, managed to secure him a scholarship to a prestigious military academy in Brienne-le-Château, in mainland France. This was his ticket, his chance to rise. His military education, UACOL, was thorough and focused heavily on artillery, a branch of the military that was becoming increasingly important in modern warfare due to advancements in cannon technology. Unlike the cavalry or infantry, artillery demanded a strong grasp of mathematics, ballistics, and logistics, subjects that suited Napoleon's analytical mind perfectly. Imagine him poring over textbooks, calculating trajectories, and dreaming of grand campaigns while other cadets might have been more interested in duels and social graces. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery, showcasing his early specialization in a critical military field. Even during his schooling, Napoleon was known for his solitary nature, his intense work ethic, and a sharp, often prickly intellect. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and military strategy. He admired classical figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, often mapping out their campaigns in his mind. It's like a super fan of history, but instead of just reading about heroes, he planned to become one. This rigorous self-education combined with his formal training gave him a comprehensive understanding of military theory that would serve him well in the turbulent years ahead. The French Revolution, as we discussed further, opened doors for a man like Napoleon. The purging of the old aristocratic officer corps meant that promotion was now based more on merit than on birth. This was revolutionary in itself, a complete upheaval of traditional military hierarchies. Napoleon, a talented and ambitious officer from a minor, new French territory, was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this shift. Historians still debate the extent to which Napoleon's Corsican heritage fostered his sense of ambition and his perception of himself as an outsider, which some argue fueled his relentless drive. Did being an other make him hungrier for success? It's a fascinating thought. A quirky fact: during his early military career, Napoleon even tried his hand at writing a novel, a romantic novella called Clisson et Eugénie, which was, thankfully for history, not a great success, proving that not every genius can do everything. It just goes to show, stick to what you're good at, especially if it involves cannons. You've learned about Napoleon's humble origins and his focused military training, a young man primed for opportunity amidst chaos. And opportunity, like a cannonball, came swiftly and decisively in Italy. Imagine a desperate French Republic still reeling from internal purges and external threats, needing a hero. They found one, not yet in Paris, but leading a ragtag army on the forgotten Italian front. This was where Napoleon's star truly began its meteoric ascent, a campaign that would define his military genius and announce his arrival on the global stage. In 1796, at just 26 years old, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy, a poorly supplied, demoralized force facing the powerful Austrian and Sardinian armies. You can picture them ragged and hungry looking at their new young general with skepticism. But Napoleon quickly ignited their spirits not just with rousing speeches, but with promises of glory and plunder. He famously told them, "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. I am going to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great towns will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." And he delivered. What followed was a series of stunning victories that baffled and humiliated his more experienced opponents. Napoleon moved his troops with incredible speed, often forcing his enemies to fight on multiple fronts or confronting them before they could fully concentrate their forces. He employed innovative tactics using concentrated artillery fire to soften enemy lines before launching swift, decisive infantry charges. It was less about brute force and more about surgical precision. He won battles like Montenotte, Millesimo Dego, and Mondovi in rapid succession against the Sardinians, forcing them to sign an armistice. One authoritative historical fact is that in just over 2 weeks in April 1796, Napoleon secured a decisive victory against the Kingdom of Sardinia, forcing them out of the First Coalition. Then came the Austrians, numerically superior and well-equipped, but Napoleon outmaneuvered them at every turn. At the Bridge of Arcole, he personally led a charge under heavy fire, a moment that cemented his legendary status among his troops. At Rivoli, he destroyed an entire Austrian army. He didn't just win battles, he shattered armies and dictated terms. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's success in Italy was primarily due to his superior strategic and tactical genius, or if the outdated, less flexible tactics of his Austrian opponents played an equally significant role. Was he just that good, or were they just that bad? It's probably a bit of both. The First Italian Campaign transformed Napoleon from an obscure general into a national hero. He didn't just defeat enemies, he conquered territory, established client republics, and sent vast amounts of plunder back to France, bolstering the Directory's coffers. He proved himself not only a brilliant military commander, but also a shrewd diplomat and administrator. A quirky fact during the Italian campaign, Napoleon would sometimes ride ahead of his army, wearing civilian clothes, and pretending to be a local just to gather intelligence firsthand. Imagine meeting a seemingly ordinary stranger who turns out to be the greatest military mind of his era. His victories in Italy weren't merely military successes. They were political triumphs that cemented his reputation as an indispensable figure, setting the stage for his ambitions far beyond the battlefield. You've witnessed Napoleon's meteoric rise in Italy, a whirlwind of victories that left Europe stunned. His ambition, however, was far from sated. Imagine a restless general too powerful to remain idle in France, yet without a direct path to further glory in Europe. The British, with their formidable navy, remained the Republic's most intractable enemy. This led to a daring, almost fantastical scheme, the Sessi Egyptian expedition. It was ostensibly about striking at British trade routes to India, but also about gathering scientific knowledge and perhaps indulging Napoleon's own romanticized vision of himself as an Eastern conqueror. In 1798, Napoleon set sail with a massive fleet and an army of 35,000 men, along with a contingent of over 160 scientists, engineers, and scholars, a veritable movable academy. You can picture the awe and perhaps confusion of soldiers marching through the sands of Egypt, past ancient pyramids under the watchful eyes of sphinxes. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a cultural encounter, albeit one initiated by invasion. The French quickly captured Alexandria and defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids. One authoritative historical fact is that during the Egyptian expedition, the Rosetta Stone was discovered by French soldiers, an accidental archaeological find that would later prove crucial to deciphering hieroglyphs. However, Napoleon's grand strategic gamble soon hit a snag, a very large, very British snag. Admiral Horatio Nelson, that pesky British naval genius, caught the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and annihilated it at the Battle of the Nile. Imagine Napoleon cut off from France, his grand strategic design crippled. It's like building an amazing sandcastle only for the tide to come in and wash away your escape route. This naval disaster essentially trapped Napoleon and his army in Egypt, forcing them to endure harsh conditions, disease, and constant skirmishes. Despite the military setbacks, the scientific and cultural aspects of the expedition were significant. The scholars meticulously documented ancient Egyptian civilization, laying the groundwork for modern Egyptology. But back on the military front, Napoleon's attempts to push into Syria were thwarted at Acre by a combined British and Ottoman force. His army was weakened, and news from France suggested the Directory, the governing body, was collapsing into corruption and inefficiency. You can almost hear the distant drums of political opportunity calling him home. Seizing the moment, Napoleon abandoned his army in Egypt, a move that was, shall we say, less than honorable, but utterly pragmatic for his ambitions. He secretly slipped through the British blockade and returned to France in October 1799. What he found was a directory widely unpopular and ripe for overthrow. This led to the Waterloo coup of 18 Brumaire. November 9, 1799, with the support of influential figures like CAS and his brother Lucien, Napoleon used his immense popularity and the loyalty of the army to stage a bloodless coup d'état. Historians still debate the extent to which Napoleon's return from Egypt was a calculated political move or a desperate escape from a failing campaign. Was he fleeing failure or strategically returning for power? Perhaps both. A quirky fact during the coup: Napoleon was initially flustered when addressing the Council of 500, reportedly stammering and almost fainting before his brother Lucien rallied the troops to clear the chamber. Even the greatest generals have their awkward moments. The Egyptian adventure, though militarily inconclusive, ultimately served its purpose for Napoleon. It provided him with a dramatic exit and a clear path to seize political power, transforming him from a general into France's de facto ruler. You've just witnessed Napoleon's dramatic return from Egypt and his decisive political maneuver, the coup of 18 Brumaire, which swept away the ineffective Directory. Imagine France exhausted by a decade of revolution, terror, and seemingly endless war, yearning for stability. Into this void stepped Napoleon, presenting himself not as another dictator, but as the guarantor of order and the protector of revolutionary gains. This was the birth of the continental, the political structure through which Napoleon would consolidate his power and begin to truly reshape France. Established in November 1799, the consulate ostensibly created a system with 3 consuls, but it was clear from the outset who held the real authority. Napoleon became the first consul, a position that rapidly accrued more and more power to himself. You can picture him, still relatively young, projecting an aura of decisive leadership, cutting through the bureaucratic inertia and indecision that had plagued previous governments. He wasn't just a military genius. He was a shrewd politician, understanding the deep desire for strong leadership after years of turmoil. The constitution of the consulate was swiftly drafted and approved by a plebiscite, a direct vote of the people, albeit one heavily manipulated to ensure a favorable outcome. This gave Napoleon a veneer of democratic legitimacy, even as he systematically centralized power in his own hands. He dissolved the existing legislative bodies and created new ones, carefully vetting their members to ensure loyalty. It's like setting up a complex executive branch, but making sure all the key appointments were your best friends and strongest supporters. One authoritative historical fact is that the Constitution of Year 8, which established the consulate, granted vast powers to the first consul, effectively making Napoleon the most powerful man in France. Napoleon immediately set about bringing order to a chaotic nation. He re-established financial stability, brought an end to the rampant inflation, and cracked down on banditry. He also sought to heal the deep divisions left by the Revolution, extending an olive branch to royalists and émigrés who were willing to accept the new regime. He even negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope, effectively bringing the Catholic Church back into a more amicable relationship with the state, a move that pleased many ordinary French citizens after years of anti-clericalism. This wasn't just political shrewdness, it was a pragmatic recognition of deeply held beliefs. Meanwhile, the wars continued. Napoleon swiftly took personal command of the army and led a daring crossing of the Alps. Remember Hannibal to confront the Austrians in Italy once more. His victory at the Battle of Marengo in 1800 secured France's position and forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Luneville in 1801, ending the Second Coalition against France. This military success further cemented his popularity and authority. Historians still debate the extent to which Napoleon's early popularity as first consul was a genuine reflection of public support for his policies, or a result of clever propaganda and suppression of dissent. Was it true love, or just a very effective public relations campaign? Probably a bit of both. A quirky fact during the consulate: Napoleon often worked 18-hour days sustained by strong coffee, dictating letters to multiple secretaries at once. It's almost like he invented multitasking before computers did. The consulate, therefore, wasn't just a transitional government. It was the foundation upon which Napoleon would build his empire, a period where his vision for a centralized, powerful France began to take concrete shape. You've witnessed Napoleon's consolidation of power under the consulate, bringing a semblance of order back to a war-weary France. But his genius wasn't confined to battlefields and political maneuvering. Imagine a nation emerging from revolution with laws that were a chaotic patchwork of old feudal customs, revolutionary decrees, and regional variations. This legal mess was a major barrier to stability and prosperity. Napoleon recognized this fundamental problem and embarked on one of his most enduring and significant achievements, the creation of the Napoleonic Code. This wasn't just a legal tidying up, it was a comprehensive overhaul that codified French civil law, bringing uniformity and clarity to a system that had been a confusing jumble for centuries. Napoleon personally presided over many of the drafting sessions of the Council of State, often working late into the night, showcasing his incredible grasp of detail and his relentless work ethic. You can picture him, a military man, delving deep into legal philosophy, cross-examining jurists, and ensuring the new laws reflected his vision for a modern state. The Napoleonic Code, formerly known as the Code Civil des Français, Civil Code of the French, was promulgated in 1804. It enshrined many of the principles of the French Revolution, solidifying them into concrete law. Key tenets included equality before the law for all men, though not women. More on that in a moment. The abolition of feudalism and all hereditary privilege, freedom of religion, and the right to choose one's occupation. It protected property rights and promoted meritocracy. It was in many ways a progressive legal framework for its time, designed to replace the arbitrary rule of the old regime with a rational, standardized system. However, it wasn't all sunshine and egalitarianism. While revolutionary in some aspects, the code also had its limitations and drawbacks. It significantly curtailed the rights of women, placing them under the authority of their fathers or husbands, and it reaffirmed slavery in French colonies, which had been abolished during the Revolution. Historians still debate the extent to which the Napoleonic Code was a continuation of revolutionary ideals or a conservative reaction that prioritized order and state authority over individual liberties. Was it a beacon of modern law or a tool for social control? It was perhaps both. One authoritative historical fact is that the Napoleonic Code established the precedent for a unified system of law that would serve as the basis for legal systems in many other countries worldwide. The impact of the Napoleonic Code extended far beyond the borders of France. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, the code was introduced into conquered territories from Belgium and the Netherlands to parts of Germany, Italy, and even Poland. Imagine whole populations suddenly subject to a clear, consistent set of laws replacing ancient, often contradictory local customs. This had a profound and lasting effect, breaking down feudal structures and fostering a sense of legal uniformity that would persist long after Napoleon's empire crumbled. A quirky fact: Napoleon considered the code his most important legacy, famously stating, "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of all my victories. But what will live forever is my civil code." Talk about knowing your priorities. The Napoleonic Code wasn't just a dusty legal document. It was a living testament to rational governance, a blueprint that shaped legal systems and individual rights for generations, proving that a pen can sometimes be mightier than a sword, even for a general like Napoleon. You've seen Napoleon, the brilliant legal architect, meticulously crafting the Napoleonic Code. But even as he enshrined revolutionary principles into law, his ambition was pushing him towards a very unrepublican destiny. Imagine the whispers in the salons of Paris, the growing pomp and ceremony surrounding the first consul. The transition from revolutionary general to absolute ruler was nearing its climax, culminating in an act of breathtaking audacity. Napoleon's self-coronation as Emperor of the French. By 1804, Napoleon had skillfully dismantled most of the remaining republican institutions and concentrated immense power in his own hands. France was stable, prosperous, and militarily dominant. He had survived assassination attempts, crushed internal dissent, and negotiated peace with most of Europe. The stage was set for the ultimate expression of his authority. The idea was to create a new dynasty providing stability and an unambiguous successor, ostensibly to prevent France from falling back into the chaos of the Revolution. It's like a corporate takeover, but instead of stocks, he was acquiring the symbolic power of centuries of monarchy. The Senate, packed with his loyalists, invited Napoleon to accept the title of hereditary emperor. A plebiscite was held again, with carefully managed results overwhelmingly approving the move. You can almost feel the collective breath held across Europe. Was this the end of the revolutionary experiment, or its ultimate fulfillment? For Napoleon, it was the logical culmination of his rise, a way to legitimize his rule on a grander, more traditional stage, placing him on par with the ancient emperors he so admired. The coronation ceremony itself, held on December 2nd, 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was designed to be a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur and symbolic significance. Pope Pius VII traveled from Rome to preside over the event, lending it an air of religious legitimacy that Napoleon carefully cultivated. However, in a stunning gesture that underscored his absolute authority and broke with centuries of tradition, Napoleon famously crowned himself rather than allowing the Pope to place the crown upon his head. He then crowned his wife, Josephine. Imagine the gasps, the murmurs as this audacious act unfolded. A general, a revolutionary, seizing the ultimate symbol of monarchical power with his own hands. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon crowned himself emperor, famously taking the imperial crown from Pope Pius VII's hands. A powerful symbolic act, asserting his power came from himself, not the church. This act signaled to the world that Napoleon's power derived not from divine right or inherited lineage, but from his own will, his achievements, and the will of the French people, as expressed through his manipulated plebiscites, of course. It was a fusion of old and new tradition and revolutionary ambition. Historians still debate the precise motivation behind Napoleon's decision to crown himself emperor. Was it a cynical power grab, a genuine belief in his destiny, or a pragmatic move to secure the stability of France? It's like asking if someone buys a fancy car for status, or because they really love driving. Often it's a mix of reasons. The empire was born, and with it a new era for Europe. The revolutionary general was now Emperor Napoleon III, and France, once a republic, was now an empire. This dramatic transformation sent a clear signal to the other great powers of Europe. Napoleon was here to stay, and he was not playing by their old rules. A quirky fact: Napoleon commissioned the famous painting of his coronation by Jacques-Louis David, and he specifically instructed the artist to depict him crowning Josephine rather than himself, likely to project an image of benevolent shared power despite what actually happened. Talk about historical spin. The coronation wasn't just a ceremony. It was a powerful statement setting the stage for the dramatic conflicts that would define the next decade of European history. You've just witnessed Napoleon crown himself emperor, a defiant act that reverberated across the continent. Imagine the monarchs of Europe, accustomed to centuries of inherited power, watching this upstart Corsican seize an imperial throne. Their fear and outrage, already simmering during the French Revolution, now boiled over. This outrage, combined with British financial might and strategic maneuvering, coalesced into a formidable alliance, the Third Coalition. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was a grand confrontation between the old order and the new, with Napoleon at its center. Even before the coronation, Great Britain under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger had been the most persistent and implacable foe of revolutionary France. Pitt understood that Napoleon's ambition, whether as consul or emperor, posed an existential threat to British naval supremacy and commercial interests. You can almost hear his stern pronouncements in Parliament warning of the dangers across the Channel. Britain consistently funded and encouraged continental powers to oppose France, acting as the financial backbone of nearly every anti-French alliance. The news of Napoleon's self-coronation in 1804 confirmed to the other major European powers, Austria and Russia, that peace with France, even the temporary peace established by the Treaty of Amiens, was fleeting. Napoleon was not content to be merely the strongest power. He clearly aimed for dominance. Austria, smarting from previous defeats, remember Napoleon's Italian campaign, harbored deep resentment and a desire to regain lost territories and prestige. Russia, under the enigmatic young Tsar Alexander III, viewed Napoleon's expansionism as a threat to the balance of power in Europe and to Russia's own influence. So in 1805, the Third Coalition officially formed, bringing together Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. This was a powerful alignment of forces aiming to roll back French gains and ideally topple Napoleon from his newly acquired throne. Imagine the flurry of diplomatic activity, the hushed meetings in palaces, the hurried deployment of armies. It was the entire continent holding its breath, preparing for a cataclysmic showdown. One authoritative historical fact is that the formation of the Third Coalition in 1805 explicitly aimed to restore the balance of power in Europe and contain Napoleonic France. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, understood the threat. His immediate response was to plan an invasion of Great Britain, massing a large army, the Armée d'Angleterre, at Boulogne. You can picture the vast encampments, the endless drills, the anticipation of crossing the narrow English Channel. But the invasion relied on gaining temporary naval supremacy, a feat that would prove impossible against the Royal Navy. Historians still debate whether Napoleon was genuinely committed to the invasion of Britain or if the Boulogne camp was primarily a feint to divert British resources and attention while he prepared for a continental war. Was it a real plan or a brilliant bluff? Perhaps a bit of both, adaptable to the changing strategic landscape. As the Austrian and Russian armies began to mobilize and march towards France, Napoleon swiftly shifted his focus from the Channel to the Rhine. With incredible speed and logistical precision, he marched his armies hundreds of miles across Europe, catching the coalition forces by surprise. This rapid deployment, often dubbed the Grand Army's March to Ulm, was a logistical marvel in itself. A quirky fact during the planning for the invasion of Britain, Napoleon even considered using hot air balloons to ferry troops across the Channel, showcasing his willingness to explore unconventional military technologies, even if they were utterly impractical at the time. Thank goodness for Nelson. Right. The formation of the Third Coalition therefore set the stage for one of the most famous and decisive campaigns in military history, forcing Napoleon to abandon his cross-channel dreams and confront his enemies on the battlefields of Central Europe. The storm clouds were gathering. You felt the tension as the Third Coalition gathered its forces poised to challenge Napoleon's burgeoning empire. Napoleon ever, the opportunist, turned his gaze from the English Channel to the heart of Central Europe, marching his grand army with astonishing speed. This swift deployment caught the unsuspecting Austrians off guard, leading to the capitulation of their army at Ulm in October 1805, a bloodless victory that shattered a significant part of the coalition's forces even before the main event. But the true masterpiece, the one that would etch Napoleon's name deeper into the annals of military history, was the Battle of Austerlitz. Imagine the frosty fields outside Austerlitz, modern-day Slavkov u Brna, in the Czech Republic on December 2, 1805, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation. A dense fog clung to the ground, obscuring the landscape. On one side stood the combined armies of Austria and Russia, commanded by their respective emperors Francis I and Alexander I. On the other, Napoleon seemingly outnumbered with his grand army. This was to be the Battle of the Three Emperors, a clash of titans, and Napoleon, ever the showman, had chosen his ground with meticulous care. He deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allies to attack it, while keeping his main force hidden behind the Pratzen Heights, a low ridge that dominated the battlefield. As the Allied forces committed their reserves to attack the seemingly vulnerable French right, the sun, famously dubbed the Sun of Austerlitz, broke through the morning fog, illuminating the Pratzen Heights. This was Napoleon's signal. His troops, who had been patiently waiting, suddenly emerged from the mist and launched a devastating assault on the Pratzen Heights, the very center of the Allied line, which had been dangerously thinned. It was a perfectly timed, audacious move, striking at the enemy's weakest point when they least expected it. You can almost hear the French shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" as they surged forward. The Allied center crumbled and their army was split in two. Napoleon then wheeled his forces to crush the Allied left flank, which was still desperately trying to capture the French right. The ensuing rout was catastrophic for the coalition. Thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers drowned trying to escape across frozen ponds, their ice cracking under cannon fire. One authoritative historical fact is that the Battle of Austerlitz is widely regarded as one of Napoleon's most brilliant tactical victories, showcasing his masterful use of deception, timing, and terrain. The scale of the Allied defeat was immense. Russia and Austria suffered tens of thousands of casualties, captured soldiers, and lost artillery. The Third Coalition was effectively shattered. Emperor Francis I of Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Pressburg, which conceded significant territories to France and Napoleon's German allies, effectively dissolving the Holy Roman Empire. Tsar Alexander I retreated with his shattered forces, a bitter lesson learned. Historians still debate whether Austerlitz was truly a victory against overwhelming odds, or if the Allied command's strategic blunders and internal disagreements contributed more significantly to their own downfall. Was it pure genius or just capitalizing on incompetence? Likely a brilliant general seizing every opportunity presented by his less astute adversaries. A quirky fact before the battle, Napoleon visited his troops, who spontaneously lit torches and raised them on their bayonets, creating a spectacular illumination of their camps, a moment that deeply moved the emperor. It's hard to imagine your boss getting such an enthusiastic display of loyalty. Austerlitz wasn't just a battle. It was a military symphony conducted by a master, cementing Napoleon's reputation as an invincible commander and reshaping the map of Central Europe with a single, decisive blow. You've just witnessed Napoleon's dazzling land triumph at Austerlitz, a victory that shattered a coalition and reshaped an empire. But even as he stood supreme on the continent, a dark shadow loomed over his ambitions: the unyielding power of the British Royal Navy. Imagine Napoleon gazing across the English Channel, his formidable Grand Army poised for invasion, yet utterly stymied by a watery barrier defended by ships that seemed invincible. This brings us to the pivotal naval encounter that would ensure British dominance of the seas and forever frustrate Napoleon's dream of invading England, the Palcobellas of Trafalgar. While Napoleon was marching his armies across Europe, culminating in Austerlitz, the naval war was also reaching its climax. For months, French and Spanish fleets had been attempting to lure or escape the British blockade, all with the ultimate aim of clearing the channel for Napoleon's invasion barges. But standing in their way was Admiral Horatio Nelson, perhaps the greatest naval commander in British history. You can picture him, a charismatic figure known for his audacious tactics and unwavering determination patrolling the seas with an almost predatory patience. On October 21, 1805, just weeks before Austerlitz, the combined French and Spanish fleets under the command of Admiral Villeneuve sailed out from Cadiz, Spain. Nelson, with his British fleet, intercepted them off Cape Trafalgar on the southwest coast of Spain. Unlike traditional naval battles where opposing lines of ships would sail parallel to each other, engaging in broadside duels, Nelson famously adopted a daring and unorthodox tactic. He split his fleet into two columns, heading directly for the enemy line at a perpendicular angle, aiming to break through and cause chaos. It was like driving a wedge through a tightly packed formation, inviting chaos. Imagine the sight: two lines of British ships led by Nelson's flagship HMS Victory, sailing headlong into the much larger enemy formation, seemingly sacrificing themselves for a bold strategic gain. The initial approach was slow and vulnerable, as the British ships couldn't fire their broadsides until they pierced the enemy line. But once they broke through, the battle devolved into a brutal close-quarters melee. Cannons roared, splinters flew, and ships grappled, unleashing devastating volleys at point-blank range. One authoritative historical fact is that Nelson's innovative crossing the T tactic at Trafalgar enabled the British to concentrate their fire and break the enemy line, leading to a decisive victory. The outcome was a crushing defeat for the Franco-Spanish forces. The British captured or destroyed 22 enemy ships, while losing none of their own, though many were heavily damaged. It was a victory of overwhelming proportions. However, victory came at a terrible cost. Admiral Nelson, fatally wounded by a French sniper, died on board HMS Victory towards the end of the battle. You can almost hear his famous last words: "Thank God I have done my duty," uttered as the sounds of victory filled the air. Historians still debate whether Nelson's aggressive tactics, while brilliantly successful, unnecessarily exposed his flagship and himself to mortal danger. Was it calculated genius or a reckless gamble that paid off? It was probably a little bit of both. A quirky fact: after the battle, the bodies of officers, including Nelson's, were preserved in barrels of brandy or rum for the journey back to England, leading to the grim nickname Nelson's Blood for rum among sailors. It's a macabre form of ancient embalming, isn't it? Trafalgar ensured that Great Britain would remain the undisputed mistress of the seas for the next century, completely frustrating Napoleon's dream of invading England and forcing him to seek other means of defeating his most persistent enemy. With naval invasion out of the question, Napoleon would now turn his strategic gaze to economic warfare, setting the stage for his next grand and ultimately flawed scheme. You've just witnessed the unyielding dominance of the British Navy at Trafalgar, a naval disaster that slammed shut the door on Napoleon's dreams of invading England. But Napoleon was not a man to admit defeat or abandon his grand ambition to humble Great Britain. Imagine a continental emperor supreme on land yet frustrated by an enemy he couldn't reach directly. His solution was an unprecedented and audacious act of economic warfare, the SAL, continental system. This wasn't about cannons and cavalry, it was about tariffs and blockades aiming to defeat Britain by crippling its economy. Convinced that an army of merchants could be more devastating than an army of soldiers, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree in November 1806, following his decisive victory over Prussia at Jena-Auerstedt. This decree declared a comprehensive trade embargo against Great Britain. No European country under French influence or allied with France was allowed to trade with the British. French ports were closed to British ships and goods, and any ship found to have traded with Britain was liable to seizure. It was like creating a giant continent-wide shopping mall, but with a strict no British products policy. The intent was clear: to destroy Britain's economy by cutting off its access to European markets. Britain, as the workshop of the world, relied heavily on exporting its manufactured goods. Napoleon believed that if he could choke off this trade, it would lead to economic collapse, widespread unemployment, and eventually internal unrest that would force Britain to sue for peace on French terms. You can almost hear him confidently explaining his grand strategy to his bewildered marshals. Why send soldiers when you can send bankruptcies? However, the continental system, could you see, was a double-edged sword far more difficult to enforce and sustain than Napoleon initially imagined. Britain, with its powerful navy, responded with its own counter-blockade known as the Orders in Council, which aimed to cut off trade to French-controlled ports. This turned the economic war into a global struggle impacting neutral shipping and eventually contributing to the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. One authoritative historical fact is that the continental system, despite its ambitious goals, ultimately failed to cripple the British economy, which found alternative markets and relied on extensive smuggling. The system also had severe consequences for Europe. Many regions, especially those reliant on British colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton, suffered shortages and economic hardship. Smuggling became rampant, undermining Napoleon's authority and creating a black market that further complicated enforcement. Imagine trying to explain to a Parisian fashionista why she couldn't have her imported silks or her husband his Cuban cigars. It created instant resentment. Historians still debate whether the continental system was a strategically viable plan that was simply undermined by insufficient naval power and widespread evasion, or if it was fundamentally flawed in its economic understanding and impractical to enforce given Europe's diverse needs. Was it a brilliant idea, poorly executed, or just a bad idea? The greatest weakness of the system was the constant need for Napoleon to enforce it, often through military means. Nations that tried to evade the blockade, like Portugal and Russia, found themselves facing French invasion. This constant need for enforcement stretched French resources, diverted troops from other fronts, and alienated former allies, becoming a significant factor in Napoleon's downfall. A quirky fact: during the height of the continental system, ingenious smugglers would sometimes carry British goods hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, or even inside coffins, showing the lengths people would go to bypass the restrictions. It's like an ancient version of a dark web marketplace, but with more bread. The continental system, therefore, was not merely an economic policy. It was a constant source of friction, a colossal gamble that ultimately strained Napoleon's empire to its breaking point, forcing his hand in places he perhaps never intended to go. You've seen Napoleon's grand economic gamble, the continental system designed to strangle Britain's economy. But, as we discussed, enforcing such an ambitious blockade proved to be a monumental challenge, a constant drain on French resources and patience. One of the most painful thorns in Napoleon's side, constantly undermining his continental ambitions, was the Iberian Peninsula, specifically Spain and Portugal. This led to a brutal, protracted conflict known as the Peninsular War. A bloody ulcer that would bleed France dry and become a persistent drain on Napoleon's Grande Armée. Portugal, a long-standing ally of Britain, stubbornly refused to comply with the continental system, continuing its lucrative trade across the Atlantic. Napoleon saw this as a direct affront to his authority and a gaping hole in his economic blockade. In 1807, he demanded that Portugal close its ports to British shipping. When they hesitated, he ordered French forces under General Junot to invade. You can picture the swift march of French troops across the Pyrenees, confident in a quick victory. The Portuguese royal family, rather than face occupation, famously fled to Brazil, taking their court and treasury with them, a fascinating transatlantic escape. However, Napoleon then made a critical miscalculation regarding Spain. He saw it as a weak, backward nation ripe for control. In 1808, under the pretext of reinforcing his army in Portugal, he covertly moved large numbers of French troops into Spain. Through a series of cunning and ruthless maneuvers, he eventually coerced the Spanish king Charles IV and his heir Ferdinand VI to abdicate, placing his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Imagine the outrage of a proud nation, their beloved monarchy summarily replaced by a foreign ruler. This wasn't just a political reshuffle, it was a profound insult to national identity and deeply held religious beliefs. The Spanish people, enraged by the perceived French treachery and the imposition of a foreign king, rose up in a fierce, widespread rebellion. This wasn't a conventional war of armies, it was a savage, relentless, guerrilla war. A term that actually comes from this conflict, meaning little war. Small bands of Spanish irregulars, often peasants or former soldiers, relentlessly harassed French supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and conducted acts of sabotage. You can almost feel the simmering hatred in the villages, the sudden violent ambushes on lonely roads. One authoritative historical fact is that the Peninsular War saw the first widespread and effective use of guerrilla warfare tactics, which significantly tied down large numbers of French troops. The British, ever opportunistic, seized this chance to open a new front on the continent. Under the brilliant leadership of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, British forces landed in Portugal in 1808, supporting the Portuguese and Spanish resistance. Historians still debate the precise moment of Napoleon's critical error in the Peninsular War. Was it his underestimation of Spanish nationalism, his decision to depose the Bourbon monarchy, or his failure to commit enough resources from the outset? It's like asking if the biggest mistake was starting the fire or just not bringing enough water to put it out. The Peninsular War became a grinding attritional conflict for the French. They faced not just conventional armies, but an entire hostile population. It drained Napoleon's treasury and, more importantly, countless thousands of his veteran troops who were desperately needed elsewhere. A quirky fact: the Spanish resistance sometimes used church bells to signal the presence of French troops, creating a network of noisy anti-French alarm systems across the countryside. Imagine trying to sneak through enemy territory when every church bell in the region is loudly announcing your arrival. The Peninsular War was a constant bleeding wound for Napoleon's empire, a testament to the power of national resistance, and a grim precursor to the even greater disaster that awaited him in the East. You've seen the relentless bleeding wound that was the Peninsular War, draining Napoleon's strength in the West. But even with that nagging problem, Napoleon still commanded immense power and proved capable of astonishing military feats. While bogged down in Spain, he faced a resurgent challenge from Austria, eager to exploit his perceived weakness. This led to another grand confrontation, a battle that would once again reaffirm Napoleon's tactical brilliance and secure French dominance for a time: the Battle of Wagram. Austria, encouraged by reports of French difficulties in Spain and hoping to reverse the humiliating losses from Austerlitz, remember that dazzling victory from Part 9, decided to form the Fifth Coalition and go to war with France again in 1809. Emperor Francis II believed the moment was ripe to strike, with many French veterans tied down in Spain. You can imagine the Austrian generals brimming with renewed confidence marching their reorganized armies into Bavaria, aiming to regain lost glory and territory. Napoleon, ever swift to respond, immediately rushed from Spain, gathered his forces, and launched a blistering counteroffensive. He executed a series of rapid maneuvers, once again demonstrating his mastery of large-scale troop movements and surprising his opponents. After a series of smaller engagements, the climactic battle took place over 2 days on July 5th, 6th, 1809, on the plains near Wagram, outside Vienna. Imagine the sheer scale of it: over 300,000 men clashing, perhaps the largest battle in European history up to that point. The Battle of Wagram was a brutal, hard-fought affair. The Austrians under Archduke Charles were more organized and determined than at Austerlitz. The first day saw costly attacks and counterattacks, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. But on the second day, Napoleon orchestrated a massive frontal assault by his infantry, supported by an unprecedented concentration of artillery, more than 100 guns firing in a single devastating battery. This grand battery pulverized the Austrian lines, creating a breach that the French infantry then exploited. You can almost feel the ground shake from the incessant cannon fire, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of battle. Despite heavy French casualties, the sustained pressure and tactical brilliance of Napoleon ultimately broke the Austrian resistance. The Archduke Charles ordered a retreat, and though well managed, it was a clear defeat. One authoritative historical fact is that the Battle of Wagram, while a costly victory, forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Schönbrunn, further reducing its territory and cementing French hegemony over much of Central Europe. Historians still debate whether Wagram showcased Napoleon at the peak of his strategic powers, or if it revealed an increasing reliance on overwhelming force and attrition, a subtle shift from the more subtle maneuvering of his earlier campaigns. Was it peak performance or the beginning of a reliance on brute strength? The victory at Wagram solidified Napoleon's dominance over continental Europe. He had once again defeated Austria, his most persistent continental foe after Britain. This victory led to a period of relative peace on the continent, though the Peninsular War continued to fester. A quirky fact: during the battle, Napoleon himself was almost hit by an Austrian cannonball, which reportedly tore a piece of his boot, a stark reminder of the ever-present danger faced even by the emperor. It just goes to show even the most powerful person can have a bad day at the office. Wagram was a hard-won triumph that underscored Napoleon's continued military genius, but it also hinted at the growing cost of his ambitions, pushing his empire to its limits even as it expanded. Oh, you've just witnessed the brutal, hard-won victory at Wagram, solidifying Napoleon's grip on Central Europe. With most of his continental adversaries humbled, a different kind of ambition began to stir within the emperor. Imagine a powerful ruler nearing his 40s with an empire stretching across much of Europe, yet lacking one crucial element: a legitimate heir. His marriage to Josephine, though affectionate, had not produced the longed-for child, and the stability of his newly forged dynasty depended on it. This personal dilemma led to a momentous, politically calculated decision: Napoleon's marriage to Maria Louise, an Austrian archduchess. The decision to divorce Empress Josephine, a woman he genuinely loved and who had been with him since his early struggling days, was agonizing for Napoleon. But the pressure for a legitimate successor to secure the continuity of his empire was immense. His marshals and advisors constantly reminded him of the fragile nature of his dynasty without an heir. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation overriding personal affection. You can almost feel the heartbreak of Josephine being asked to step aside for the good of the empire. Napoleon sought a bride from one of Europe's old established royal houses. This wasn't just about producing an heir. It was about legitimacy, about weaving his parvenu dynasty into the ancient tapestry of European royalty. A marriage alliance with a major power would also, he hoped, create stronger diplomatic bonds and reduce the likelihood of future wars. His eyes turned to the Habsburgs, the venerable imperial family of Austria, his recently defeated foe. It was a brilliant, if cynical, piece of political maneuvering. Maria Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria, the same emperor Napoleon had so recently defeated at Austerlitz, and Wagram was chosen as his bride. She was understandably reluctant to marry the man who had brought so much humiliation to her family and empire. Imagine being a young princess suddenly told you must marry the dreaded Corsican ogre, your family's bitter enemy. It was a sacrifice for dynastic reasons. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon divorced Josephine in December 1809 and married Maria Louise by proxy in March 1810, solidifying a crucial dynastic alliance. The marriage ceremony in Paris in April 1810 was a spectacle of imperial grandeur designed to impress both France and Europe. Maria Louise proved to be a dutiful, if not passionate, wife, and crucially for Napoleon's ambitions, she quickly became pregnant. In March 1811, she gave birth to a son christened Napoleon François Charles Joseph Bonaparte and immediately given the title King of Rome. The dynasty seemed secure. Historians still debate the true depth of Napoleon's feelings for Maria Louise after their marriage. Was it a purely political union, or did genuine affection grow between them? It's like asking if an arranged marriage can ever truly become a love match. This marriage, however, did not bring the lasting peace Napoleon hoped for. While it temporarily calmed relations with Austria, it alienated Russia, which had also offered a princess for Napoleon's hand. It also showed the other European powers that Napoleon was not just a general, but a dynastic builder, an even greater threat to the old order. A quirky fact: Josephine, after her divorce, was granted a magnificent country estate and a generous allowance, and she and Napoleon remained on good terms, with him visiting her frequently and writing her affectionate letters showing a surprisingly tender side to the ruthless emperor. Even the most ambitious men can be sentimental, it seems. The marriage to Maria Louise, therefore, was a pinnacle of Napoleon's political consolidation, fulfilling his personal desire for an heir and seemingly solidifying his place among Europe's monarchs, but inadvertently sowing seeds of future conflict that would prove far more devastating than any personal heartbreak. You've observed Napoleon, the self-crowned emperor, securing his dynasty with a new empress and a long-awaited heir. His empire by 1811 seemed at its zenith, stretching across Europe, enforced by victorious armies and a web of client states. But even at this peak, the seeds of his eventual downfall were being sown, most notably in the East, leading to the catastrophic Russian campaign. Imagine the sheer hubris of a man who, having conquered most of Western Europe, turns his gaze to the vast, unforgiving expanse of Russia, envisioning a swift, decisive victory against an empire whose very size was its greatest defense. The reasons behind this momentous invasion were multifaceted, a complex blend of economic pressure, personal slights, and geopolitical ambition. At its heart was the ongoing failure of the continental system. Remember that economic blockade from Part 11, Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, found the blockade increasingly detrimental to its economy, especially its lucrative trade with Great Britain. Despite the Treaty of Tilsit 1807, which had ostensibly allied France and Russia, economic necessity led Russia to quietly resume trade with Britain, a blatant defiance of Napoleon's decree. You can almost hear the exasperated sighs from Napoleon's advisors as he received reports of British goods flowing into Russian ports. Beyond economics, personal relations between Napoleon and Alexander Varai had soured. Alexander resented Napoleon's growing influence in Central Europe, particularly the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a French client state carved from former Polish territories which Russia viewed as a potential precursor to Polish independence, and Napoleon's annexation of Oldenburg ruled by Alexander's brother-in-law. There was also the lingering insult of Napoleon's rejection of a Russian Grand Duchess as a potential bride before he settled on Maria Louise, recall Part 14. It was a simmering feud now ready to boil over. Napoleon, confident in his military genius and believing that a swift, decisive strike would force Alexander back into line, decided on a massive invasion. He amassed the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire, French, German, Italian, Polish, Dutch, and more. It was a logistical nightmare even before it began. You can picture the endless columns of soldiers' wagons and horses stretching for miles, a human tide, preparing to engulf a vast nation. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon's Grande Armée for the Russian campaign in 1812 comprised over 600,000 soldiers, making it the largest invasion force assembled up to that point in history. Historians still debate the precise miscalculation that led to Napoleon's decision to invade Russia. Was it an overestimation of his own invincibility, a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian geography and climate, or a desperate attempt to shore up the failing continental system? It's like asking if someone starts a marathon without training because they're arrogant, ignorant of the distance, or just really, really stubborn. The sheer scale of the undertaking, the vast distances, the harsh climate, and the scorched earth tactics that the Russians would employ, all of these factors were underestimated by Napoleon. A quirky fact: Napoleon, in his meticulous planning, even ordered hundreds of thousands of special boots for his soldiers, but many were ill-fitting or of poor quality, leading to widespread foot injuries and desertion even before battle was joined. So a campaign meant to conquer an empire was being undermined by bad footwear. The stage was set for one of history's most epic and tragic military blunders, a campaign that would test the limits of human endurance and begin the inexorable unraveling of Napoleon's seemingly unshakable empire. The drums of war now beat towards the vast, silent plains of Russia. You've imagined the colossal Grande Armée, poised on the brink of invading Russia, a human wave of unprecedented scale. Napoleon's plan, as always, was to force a decisive battle early on, destroy the Russian army, and dictate peace terms. But the Russians, under the pragmatic leadership of generals like Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, refused to play by Napoleon's rules. Instead, they employed a shrewd and frustrating strategy: constant retreat, drawing the French deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian interior, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. You can almost feel Napoleon's growing exasperation as his grand army marched for weeks through empty villages and scorched fields. This long, arduous march, punctuated only by minor skirmishes, sapped the Grande Armée's strength. Disease, desertion, and exhaustion claimed more lives than any enemy bullet. Horses, crucial for cavalry and artillery, died in droves due to lack of fodder. By the time Napoleon reached the vicinity of Moscow in September 1812, his army was already a shadow of its former self. But the Russians finally decided to make a stand to protect their ancient capital. This led to the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino. Imagine the dawn of September 7, 1812, on a series of rolling hills and ravines, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow. The terrain was dotted with small villages and dense woods, perfect for defensive strongholds. On one side, the Russian army entrenched in formidable earthworks and redoubts, resolute in defending their homeland. On the other, the Grande Armée, weary but still formidable, eager for the decisive engagement they had marched so far to find. The battle began with a thunderous artillery barrage, a crescendo of cannon fire that would last for hours. What followed was a day of unimaginable carnage. The French launched wave after wave of assaults against the Russian fortifications, particularly the Bagration flèches, arrowhead-shaped earthen works, and the Revsky redoubt. Charges by cavalry and infantry were met with fierce Russian resistance, often devolving into brutal hand-to-hand combat amidst thick clouds of gunpowder smoke. You can almost hear the screams, the clash of bayonets, the desperate cries for reinforcements. Napoleon committed his imperial guard only sparingly, a decision that has been heavily scrutinized by historians ever since. One authoritative historical fact is that the Battle of Borodino resulted in an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 casualties combined on both sides in a single day, making it one of the deadliest battles in history relative to the forces engaged. Despite the horrific losses, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The French captured the Russian defensive positions, but the Russian army, though battered, remained largely intact and withdrew in good order. It was a tactical victory for Napoleon as he held the field, but a strategic stalemate. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's hesitant commitment of the Imperial Guard at Borodino was a critical mistake that prevented a more decisive victory, or a prudent decision to preserve his elite reserve for future engagements. Was he too cautious or wisely preserving his best troops? It's a classic battlefield conundrum. A quirky fact: during the battle, some French soldiers reportedly ran out of musket balls and resorted to using pebbles and even buttons as makeshift projectiles, highlighting the desperate intensity of the fighting. Imagine firing a button at an enemy. Borodino was a Pyrrhic victory for Napoleon, opening the road to Moscow, but at a terrible human cost. It demonstrated the immense resilience of the Russian army and the horrifying price of a frontal assault against a determined defense. The path to Moscow was now clear, but what awaited Napoleon there would prove even more devastating than the battlefield's carnage. You've just witnessed the brutal, blood-soaked stalemate of Borodino, a battle that technically opened the road to Moscow, but at a horrifying cost. Napoleon, believing that the capture of the Russian capital would force Tsar Alexander I to sue for peace, pressed on. Imagine the Grande Armée, now significantly diminished, marching into a city they expected to find teeming with people, bustling with commerce and ripe for the taking. What they found instead on September 14, 1812, was an eerie, ominous silence. Moscow's burning. The Russians, rather than defend their sacred capital to the last man, had deliberately evacuated Moscow. As the French entered the deserted city, a terrifying series of fires broke out, rapidly consuming large parts of the ancient city. It's a moment steeped in tragic irony. Napoleon the Conqueror had taken his prize only for it to vanish in a conflagration. The fires were deliberately set, likely by order of Moscow's governor, Count Fyodor Rostopchin, to deny the French supplies and shelter and to prevent them from establishing winter quarters. You can almost feel the heat, smell the acrid smoke, and hear the crackling roar of the inferno consuming the wooden city. The occupation of Moscow was a nightmare for the French. Instead of finding relief and provisions, they found a burning ruin. Supplies, already stretched thin, became even scarcer. Discipline began to break down as soldiers resorted to looting the remaining houses. Napoleon, accustomed to dictating terms after capturing a capital, found himself in an impossible situation. The Tsar refused to negotiate, hoping that the harsh Russian winter and Napoleon's deteriorating logistical situation would do what his armies could not. He simply waited, playing a terrifying game of patience. Napoleon lingered in Moscow for over a month, desperately hoping for a peace overture that never came. As the days shortened and the first biting frosts appeared, the grim reality set in. His army, weakened by battle disease and the lack of proper sustenance, could not sustain itself through the notorious Russian winter. It became clear that staying meant annihilation. One authoritative historical fact is that the burning of Moscow, whether entirely deliberate or exacerbated by circumstance, deprived Napoleon's army of vital winter quarters and supplies, critically undermining his campaign. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon made the agonizing decision to begin the Paris retreat from Moscow. This was not a strategic withdrawal. It was the beginning of an epic, horrific struggle for survival. Historians still debate whether Napoleon waited too long in Moscow, thereby sealing his army's fate, or if political necessity demanded that he at least attempt to secure a peace treaty. Was it hubris or a desperate hope? It's a question that continues to haunt military strategists. The initial stages of the retreat were relatively orderly, but conditions rapidly deteriorated. Napoleon attempted to take a southern route hoping for better foraging and an escape from the scorched earth policy, but he was blocked by the reconstituted Russian army at Maloyaroslavets. Forced back onto the ravaged northern road they had taken to Moscow, the Grande Armée began its long, frozen nightmare. A quirky fact: during the occupation of Moscow, some French officers reportedly tried to put on plays and concerts in the burning city, a surreal attempt to maintain normalcy amidst utter devastation. Imagine trying to enjoy a symphony while your surroundings are literally on fire. The burning of Moscow wasn't just a fire, it was a beacon signaling the beginning of Napoleon's downfall, an act of defiance that turned his grand conquest into a desolate trap, setting the stage for one of history's most harrowing military retreats. You've left Moscow, burning a city consumed by flames, and a symbol of Napoleon's strategic trap. Now imagine the chilling onset of the notorious Russian winter, not as a gentle snowfall, but as a relentless, unforgiving enemy. The Great Retreat from Russia, beginning in October 1812, was not merely a military withdrawal. It was an epic, agonizing struggle for survival against the elements' starvation and a relentlessly pursuing enemy. This was arguably the darkest chapter in Napoleon's military career, a nightmare march that decimated his once invincible Grande Armée. As the French army trudged westward following the same scorched and plundered route they had taken to Moscow, the conditions rapidly worsened. The initial autumn chill quickly gave way to bitter cold, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing. Blizzards swept across the vast plains, disorienting soldiers and burying meager roads under drifts of snow. You can almost feel the biting wind on your face, the numb ache in your fingers and toes, as you shuffle along with thousands of starving, freezing comrades. The men, many of whom were poorly clothed for such extremes, suffered terribly from frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation. Discipline, which had been the hallmark of the Grande Armée, began to disintegrate. Soldiers abandoned their equipment, then their weapons, then their comrades, becoming a desperate horde simply trying to survive. The thousands of horses essential for cavalry and hauling artillery and supplies died off in staggering numbers, often eaten by the starving troops. This left cannons and vital wagons stranded, further accelerating the army's collapse. It was a terrifying domino effect of disaster. Meanwhile, the pursuing Russian army, though also suffering relentlessly, harassed the flanks and rear of the retreating French. Cossack raids, partisan attacks, and regular army skirmishes picked off stragglers and isolated detachments, preventing any chance of organized foraging or rest. Imagine constantly looking over your shoulder, knowing that death could come not just from the cold, but from a sudden ambush. One authoritative historical fact is that during the retreat from Moscow, Napoleon's Grande Armée suffered catastrophic losses, with estimates of over 400,000 deaths from combat disease, starvation, and exposure, and tens of thousands captured. The most infamous episode of the retreat was the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. The Russians destroyed the main bridge, forcing the French engineers, under immense pressure and constant enemy fire, to construct makeshift pontoon bridges across the partially frozen river. Thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and wagons crammed onto these flimsy structures, leading to horrific scenes of panic, crushing, and drowning as the Russians shelled the crossing. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's leadership during the Berezina crossing was a heroic feat that saved the remnants of his army, or if the scale of the disaster was ultimately unavoidable given the circumstances. Was it a triumph of command or a desperate last stand? Napoleon eventually left the shattered remnants of his army in the hands of his marshals and sped back to Paris by sleigh, desperate to raise new forces and quell any rumors of his defeat. He left behind a wasteland of corpses, abandoned equipment, and the chilling silence of a destroyed army. A quirky fact many Russian peasants unfamiliar with the foreign languages of Napoleon's multinational army simply referred to the French soldiers regardless of their nationality as French devils during the retreat. It just goes to show how unified a desperate population can become. The Great Retreat from Russia was a catastrophe of epic proportions, a turning point that exposed the vulnerability of Napoleon's empire and galvanized his enemies across Europe sensing weakness, where before there had only been invincible strength. You've endured the chilling horrors of the Great Retreat from Russia, a devastating blow that shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and left his once grand army in tatters. Imagine the whispers spreading across Europe. He's not invincible. The smell of weakness like blood in the water galvanized his old enemies. This catastrophic defeat provided the perfect opportunity for the major European powers to renew their efforts to finally bring down the French emperor, leading to the rapid formation of the Sixth Coalition. Even as Napoleon raced back to Paris to raise new armies, the diplomatic wheels of Europe began to spin furiously. Great Britain, ever the financial backbone of anti-French alliances, saw its chance and immediately offered subsidies and support to any nation willing to take up arms again. Russia, emboldened by its miraculous victory and driven by a desire to pursue Napoleon into Central Europe, was naturally the first to join. You can almost hear the jubilant toasts in the Tsar's court celebrating their miraculous deliverance from the French onslaught. Prussia, long chafing under French domination and humiliated by past defeats, was next to join. King Frederick William III, under immense popular pressure and sensing a shift in the tide of war, declared war on France in March 1813. This was a particularly significant defection for Napoleon as it opened up a new front in Germany and fueled German nationalist sentiment against French occupation. Imagine the fervor in Berlin as young men rushed to volunteer, eager to throw off the Napoleonic yoke. Austria, Napoleon's father-in-law's realm. Remember, Maria Louise from Part 14 initially tried to mediate but secretly prepared for war. Prince Metternich, the shrewd Austrian foreign minister, played a complex diplomatic game, hoping to secure favorable terms for Austria without committing too early. However, as Napoleon continued to refuse any significant concessions, Austria formally joined the coalition in August 1813. This was the final decisive blow to Napoleon's diplomatic position, as his most powerful continental ally by marriage now stood against him. One authoritative historical fact is that the Sixth Coalition, formed between 1813 and 1814, comprised Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and a host of smaller German states, representing an unprecedented united front against Napoleon. Napoleon, despite the monumental losses in Russia, demonstrated his astonishing administrative and organizational genius by rapidly raising a new army. He conscripted young, inexperienced recruits, often derisively called Marie Louises, after the Empress, reflecting their youth and inexperience, and managed to equip them with incredible speed. He still commanded immense loyalty and awe, and many rushed to rally to his banner. You can picture the frantic drilling of these new recruits, turning boys into soldiers in mere weeks. However, this new army lacked the veteran experience and cohesive spirit of the Grande Armée that had perished in Russia. The quality of his cavalry, crucial for reconnaissance and pursuit, was particularly diminished. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's resilience in raising a new army after Russia was a testament to his unbreakable will, or a demonstration of France's ultimate exhaustion as he scraped the bottom of the barrel for manpower. Was it heroic perseverance, or a desperate last gasp? It's a bit of both, a tragic spectacle of a leader refusing to admit defeat. The stage was set for the decisive campaign of 1813 in Germany. The Sixth Coalition, united and determined, now vastly outnumbered Napoleon's rebuilt forces. The long years of French domination had fostered a deep desire for liberation across Europe, turning this conflict into a war of popular resistance in many areas. A quirky fact: during the 1813 campaign, Allied forces developed the Trachenberg Plan, a strategy to avoid direct engagement with Napoleon himself, and, instead, focus on defeating his marshals and other commanders, aiming to wear down his army without risking a direct confrontation with the emperor's genius. It was a clever way to fight the man, not the myth. The formation of the Sixth Coalition marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire, as the combined might and renewed determination of Europe now converged on the heart of Germany, seeking a final reckoning. You've witnessed the formidable Sixth Coalition rising, sensing blood in the water after Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation on European soil, a titanic clash that would determine the fate of Napoleon's empire and the balance of power for generations. This was the one. Battle of Leipzig, often dubbed the Battle of the Nations. A colossal engagement that saw hundreds of thousands of soldiers from nearly every major European power arrayed against Napoleon's rebuilt but ultimately outmatched army. The year is 1813. After a series of initial skirmishes and a somewhat indecisive battle at Dresden, Napoleon concentrated his forces around the city of Leipzig in Saxony. His strategic goal was to defeat the individual Allied armies before they could fully unite. However, the coalition, adhering to their Trachenberg Plan, remember that quirky fact from Part 19 about avoiding Napoleon, directly maneuvered to surround him, forcing him into a massive pitched battle on ground of their choosing. You can almost feel the tension building as armies converged from all directions on a single point. The Battle of Leipzig raged for 4 brutal days, from October 16th to 19th, 1813. It was the largest battle in European history prior to World War I, involving over 500,000 soldiers. Imagine the sheer overwhelming scale: vast lines of infantry stretching for miles, thunderous cavalry charges across open fields, and artillery barrages that shook the very earth ceaseless for days on end. The coalition forces, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, Swedish, and numerous German states, attacked Napoleon's positions from all sides, slowly tightening the noose. The fighting was incredibly fierce, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. Napoleon, despite being heavily outnumbered, his army of around 190,000 faced over 330,000 Allied troops, displayed flashes of his old brilliance, skillfully defending his positions and launching powerful counterattacks. On the first day, he even managed to inflict heavy losses on the coalition and nearly broke their lines. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the Allies, combined with their coordinated efforts, and the arrival of fresh reinforcements, notably the Prussian Corps, slowly but surely overwhelmed the French. One authoritative historical fact is that the Battle of Leipzig involved more than 600,000 soldiers combined, resulting in over 100,000 casualties, making it the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. The turning point came on October 18th, the Battle of the Nations proper, when the Allied forces launched a concentrated all-out assault from every direction. The French lines, stretched thin and exhausted, began to crack. The final blow came when Saxon troops fighting for Napoleon defected en masse to the Allied side, turning their guns on their former comrades. Historians still debate whether Napoleon could have avoided the decisive defeat at Leipzig by retreating earlier, or, if his political imperative to maintain control of Germany forced him to make a stand against overwhelming odds. Was it military stubbornness or political necessity? On October 19th, Napoleon ordered a desperate retreat across the Elster River. However, a crucial bridge was prematurely blown, trapping tens of thousands of French and Allied soldiers on the wrong side, leading to a desperate scramble and massive captures. You can almost hear the cries of despair as soldiers realized their escape route was cut off. A quirky fact: during the retreat from Leipzig, many French soldiers simply discarded their boots in the muddy fields to move faster, leaving behind a trail of abandoned footwear that stretched for miles. Imagine a landscape littered with thousands of single shoes, a grim monument to a lost battle. Leipzig was a crushing, undeniable defeat for Napoleon, the most significant of his career up to that point. It marked the end of French domination in Germany and forced Napoleon back across the Rhine, signaling the beginning of the end for his empire. The fight for Europe would now move onto French soil. You've just witnessed the monumental defeat at Leipzig, where the Battle of the Nations pushed Napoleon's shattered forces back across the Rhine. Imagine the collective relief mixed with grim determination spreading across Europe as the Allied armies, now united and emboldened, prepared for the unprecedented, the Crook, Allied invasion of France. For years, Napoleon had dictated terms from conquered capitals. Now the tide had irrevocably turned, and the very heartland of his empire lay vulnerable. The winter of 1813-1814 saw the coalition armies, a colossal force comprising Prussians, Austrians, Russians, and other allies, marching towards France from multiple directions. The goal was no longer just to defeat Napoleon in battle, but to dismantle his empire and restore a stable balance of power in Europe. This meant directly challenging Napoleon on his home turf, a strategic necessity that many generals had long feared due to his legendary defensive prowess. You can almost feel the biting winter cold and the nervous anticipation of the invading armies as they crossed the French border. Napoleon, despite the overwhelming odds, fought a brilliant defensive campaign. With a hastily assembled army largely composed of young, inexperienced conscripts and older veterans, he waged what many historians consider one of his most audacious campaigns. He moved with incredible speed, striking at fragmented Allied columns, attempting to defeat them in detail before they could concentrate their forces. This Campaign of France in 1814 showcased flashes of his old genius, winning several smaller victories against numerically superior foes, often against the predictions of his own marshals. It was like a desperate, brilliant chess player, outnumbered still managing to checkmate a few pieces. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the coalition was too great. Even Napoleon's tactical brilliance could not compensate for the vast disparity in manpower. While he won battles like Champaubert and Montmirail, inflicting heavy casualties on the Prussians and Russians, these victories were never decisive enough to break the coalition. They simply had too many soldiers to commit too many reserves to call upon. Imagine trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. No matter how fast you bail, the water keeps coming in. As the Allied armies steadily advanced, a new political dimension emerged. The coalition powers issued the Declaration of Frankfurt, offering Napoleon peace terms that would have allowed him to remain Emperor of France, albeit within its natural frontiers, roughly pre-revolutionary borders. Napoleon, ever ambitious and perhaps deluded by his defensive successes, rejected these terms, believing he could still win a decisive victory. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's refusal to accept the Frankfurt proposals was a fatal error of judgment or a reflection of his unyielding belief in his destiny and the instability of any peace not dictated by him. Was it stubborn pride or a realistic assessment of a hollow peace? The final push came as the Allied armies bypassed Napoleon's main force and marched directly on Paris. On March 30th, 1814, Paris, defended by a small force under Marshal Marmont, capitulated after a brief fight. The sight of Allied troops marching through the streets of his capital was the ultimate humiliation for Napoleon. A quirky fact, Tsar Alexander the First of Russia, upon entering Paris, deliberately made a point of visiting sites associated with the French Revolution and Enlightenment, showcasing a curious blend of triumphalism and intellectual curiosity. It's like conquering a city and immediately heading to its libraries. The Allied invasion of France was the culmination of years of relentless warfare, a strategic and political masterpiece by the coalition that finally brought the war to Napoleon's doorstep, leading inevitably to his downfall. You've watched the Allied armies march triumphantly into Paris, a sight that must have been utterly unthinkable just a few years prior. For Napoleon, trapped between converging enemy forces and with his capital fallen, the game was finally irrevocably over. Imagine the scene at Fontainebleau, Napoleon's imperial residence outside Paris in April 1814. His marshals, tired of endless war and disillusioned by defeat, finally confronted him, refusing to fight on. This led to the agonizing yet inevitable moment of his first abdication and exile to Elba. Napoleon, still confident in his own genius and buoyed by his recent tactical victories, initially intended to march on Paris and reclaim his capital. But his most trusted marshals, including Ney Berthier and Marmont, made it clear they would not follow him. They were weary, their armies shattered, and they saw no path to victory. Their refusal was a devastating blow, a betrayal of loyalty that Napoleon felt deeply. You can almost hear the heated arguments, the clash between a general's will and his exhausted subordinates' pragmatism. Faced with this united opposition from his own commanders and the overwhelming strength of the coalition, Napoleon was left with no choice. On April 6, 1814, he formally abdicated his throne, not unconditionally, but in favor of his young son Napoleon II, with Empress Maria Louise as regent. The Allies, however, rejected this conditional abdication. They demanded his complete and unconditional relinquishment of power. Imagine the frustration, the final bitter taste of defeat, as his last grand design was thwarted. Finally, on April 11, 1814, Napoleon signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which formalized his unconditional abdication. In return, he was granted sovereignty over the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany and allowed to retain his imperial title, along with a small personal guard. He was also given a considerable annual income paid by France. It was a bizarre retirement package for the man who had conquered Europe. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon signed his unconditional abdication at Fontainebleau on April 11, 1814, paving the way for his exile to Elba. The transition was not without its emotional moments. On April 20th, Napoleon bid a tearful farewell to his old guard, his most loyal veterans, in the courtyard of Fontainebleau. He kissed the eagle standard, the symbol of his army, a poignant scene that highlighted the deep bond between the emperor and his most devoted soldiers. You can almost feel the collective sorrow, the end of an era witnessed by battle-hardened men. His journey to Elba was marked by both public demonstrations of support and hostile crowds, especially in areas of southern France that had suffered greatly under his rule. Arriving on Elba in May 1814, Napoleon set about organizing his miniature empire with characteristic energy, supervising road construction, reforming the iron mines, and even designing a new flag. Historians still debate whether Napoleon genuinely intended to live out his days peacefully on Elba, or if he was already plotting his return from the moment he set foot on the island. Was it sincere retirement? Or a temporary strategic withdrawal? Given his history, it's hard to imagine the former. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbons were restored to the throne in the person of Louis XVII, the brother of the executed Louis XVIII. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, convinced that the Napoleonic nightmare was finally over. A quirky fact: during his time on Elba, Napoleon became quite fond of the island's small opera house and would frequently attend performances, sometimes even requesting specific arias. Imagine the world's greatest conqueror enjoying a quiet night at the opera. The first abdication and exile to Elba seemed like the final curtain for Napoleon, a dramatic end to a tumultuous career. But as history would soon reveal, the show wasn't quite over yet. You've left Napoleon, the exiled emperor, busily reorganizing his tiny island of Elba, a captive tiger still sharpening its claws. Meanwhile, in the grand halls of Vienna, Europe's triumphant powers gathered to pick up the pieces of a continent shattered by 2 decades of war. Imagine a glittering assembly of monarchs, ministers, and diplomats all jockeying for power and prestige, attempting to redraw the map of Europe and restore the old order. This was the Congress of Vienna, a monumental effort to establish a lasting peace and prevent another Napoleonic-style upheaval. The Congress officially convened in September 1814, though many of the key negotiations had been ongoing for months. It was attended by representatives from nearly every European state, large and small, but the real power lay with the Big Four: Austria, represented by Prince Clemens von Metternich, the shrewd host Great Britain Lord Castlereagh, later the Duke of Wellington, Russia, Tsar Alexander I, keen to expand Russian influence, and Prussia, Prince Karl August von Hardenberg. You can picture the lavish balls, the endless banquets, the intricate dances of diplomacy and intrigue that characterized this grand gathering. It was less a serious negotiation and more a continuous party with serious business conducted in whispered conversations over champagne. The primary goals of the Congress were to restore the balance of power in Europe, prevent any one nation from becoming too dominant, especially France, and suppress the revolutionary and nationalist ideas that Napoleon's conquests had inadvertently spread. They aimed to roll back the clock as much as possible to the pre-1789 order, restoring legitimate monarchies and traditional borders. It was like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube after a giant explosive toothpaste fight. Key decisions included the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France. Louis XIII, remember him, the creation of a strong buffer state on France's northern border, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and significant territorial adjustments across Central Europe, particularly for Prussia and Austria. Russia gained more of Poland, while Great Britain secured its colonial gains and maritime dominance. One authoritative historical fact is that the Congress of Vienna fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe, establishing a conservative order that would largely endure for nearly half a century. However, the Congress wasn't without its tensions. Disputes over territory, particularly Poland and Saxony, nearly led to renewed conflict between the victorious allies themselves. Metternich and Castlereagh secretly allied against Russia and Prussia at one point, highlighting the underlying rivalries even among the victors. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the Congress of Vienna in achieving its stated goal of lasting peace. Was it a cynical restoration of old elites that merely suppressed underlying tensions, or a pragmatic and successful effort to prevent immediate future wars? It's like asking if sweeping dust under the rug truly cleans the room. While the diplomats danced and deliberated, the shadow of the past lingered. Napoleon, confined to Elba, was a constant, unsettling presence. The powers in Vienna were confident he was safely contained, but as we know, a lion in a cage can still roar. A quirky fact: the Congress of Vienna was so famous for its social events that the common phrase, "the Congress dances, but it does not advance," became popular, reflecting the perception that little serious work was being done amidst all the festivities. Imagine spending months at a diplomatic party, trying to subtly outmaneuver your rivals over petits fours. The Congress of Vienna, therefore, was a monumental attempt to reset Europe after the Napoleonic storm, but it was operating under the assumption that the storm's greatest force was safely confined. That assumption, as the world was about to discover, was gloriously, spectacularly wrong. You've seen the grand post-war dance of diplomats at the Congress of Vienna, meticulously redrawing maps and restoring old monarchies, all while believing their greatest threat was safely contained on a tiny island. But as we know, a force like Napoleon isn't easily contained by treaties or remote exile. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the sheer panic that rippled through those elegant ballrooms when news arrived that the Corsican ogre had escaped his cage. This was the beginning of the 100 Days. A breathtakingly audacious gamble that saw Napoleon make one last desperate attempt to reclaim his empire. On February 26, 1815, less than a year after his abdication, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with a small contingent of his imperial guard, around 1,000 loyal followers, and sailed for France. You can picture the daring escape under the cover of night, a clandestine departure that defied all expectations. He landed near Cannes on March 1st and immediately began his march north towards Paris. His gamble was that the French people, disillusioned with the restored Bourbon monarchy of Louis XVII, remember him from Part 22, would rally to his banner. And rally they did. As Napoleon advanced, he was met not with resistance, but with growing enthusiasm. Regiments sent to intercept him famously changed sides, declaring their loyalty to the emperor. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XV that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, famously embraced his former commander and joined his cause. It was a snowball effect, a phenomenon driven by Napoleon's charisma and the widespread discontent with the Bourbons, who were seen as trying to undo the gains of the revolution and empire. Imagine a general sent to capture you, who then just hugs you and joins your team. That's some serious charisma. Louis XVI, realizing the utter futility of resistance, fled Paris on March 19th. The very next day, March 20th, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris to a rapturous welcome, resuming his throne without firing a single shot. This astonishing, bloodless reconquest of power earned the period its famous name, the 100 Days. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon successfully returned to power in France without engaging in a single battle, largely due to the armies and much of the populace's disillusionment with the Bourbon Restoration. Of course, the powers gathered at Vienna were aghast. Their carefully constructed peace was shattered. They immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and an enemy of mankind, refusing any negotiations and resolving to raise new armies to crush him once and for all. Imagine the furious diplomatic flurry, the urgent dispatches sent across Europe, transforming lavish balls back into war councils. Historians still debate the true level of popular support for Napoleon during the 100 Days. Was it a genuine national uprising or primarily a military coup fueled by loyalty to a charismatic leader? It's like asking if a rock concert is popular because of the music or just the lead singer's stage presence. Napoleon, aware that time was against him and that the coalition armies would soon be on the march, immediately set about raising a new army. He attempted to portray himself as a reformed constitutional monarch seeking peace, but the Allied powers were not fooled. They knew his true nature. A quirky fact during his march to Paris: Napoleon carried the tricolor flag, a symbol of the revolution and empire, which was banned under the Bourbon Restoration. Soldiers and peasants would rush to join him, crying, "Vive l'Empereur," and often donning old tricolor cockades they had hidden away. It was a potent symbol, reigniting old loyalties. The 100 Days was a magnificent, desperate gamble, a final, audacious act of a man who refused to be confined, setting the stage for the ultimate climactic showdown that would decide the fate of Europe once and for all. The curtain was rising for the final act. You've just witnessed Napoleon's astonishing return during the 100 Days, a bloodless reconquest of power that sent shivers down the spines of Europe's monarchs. Now, as the coalition armies rapidly mobilized, Napoleon knew his only chance was to strike first, defeat his enemies in detail, and prevent their overwhelming numbers from crushing him. His target was the Anglo-Dutch-Belgian army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher, both concentrating in Belgium. This final campaign began with two concurrent brutal engagements, the battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras. Napoleon's strategic genius, even after his exile, was still sharp. His plan was to drive a wedge between Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blücher's Prussians' defeat each separately, and then deal with the arriving Austrian and Russian forces. It was a classic Napoleonic maneuver aiming for decisive, swift victories before his opponents could unite. He moved his army rapidly north towards the Belgian border in early June 1815, hoping to catch the Allies off guard. You can almost feel the nervous tension in the air, the crackle of anticipation before the storm. On June 16, 1815, two major battles unfolded simultaneously. Napoleon himself, with the main body of his army, attacked the Prussians at Ligny. Blücher, a fiery and aggressive commander despite his advanced age, deployed his troops on high ground determined to stand and fight. The battle was a savage, close-quarters affair, characterized by relentless French infantry assaults and determined Prussian resistance. Cannons roared, muskets blazed, and bayonets clashed in the villages and fields around Ligny. One authoritative historical fact is that at Ligny, Napoleon inflicted a significant defeat on the Prussians, forcing Blücher's army to retreat, though not in complete disarray. Meanwhile, a few miles to the west, Marshal Ney, commanding Napoleon's left wing, engaged elements of Wellington's army at Quatre Bras. This crossroads was strategically vital as it lay on Wellington's direct line of communication with Blücher. The battle was a confused, fierce struggle for control of the crossroads and the surrounding woods and farms. Wellington, caught somewhat by surprise, and with many of his troops still marching to join him, fought a defensive action, often personally leading charges to stem French advances. Imagine the desperate fighting around farmhouses, the back-and-forth struggle for every patch of ground. Neither Ligny nor Quatre Bras was a complete crushing victory for Napoleon, though Ligny was a clear French success. At Ligny, the Prussians suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat, but crucially they withdrew to the north, allowing them to remain in contact with Wellington. At Quatre Bras, Ney failed to decisively defeat Wellington or prevent him from reinforcing his positions, and the battle ended in a stalemate with both sides holding their ground. Historians still debate whether Ney's failure to capture Quatre Bras decisively, or his delayed movement of troops between the two battles, was a critical error that prevented Napoleon from achieving a total victory on June 16th. Was it a marshal's mistake, or an inherent flaw in the complex two-pronged plan? A quirky fact: during the Battle of Ligny Field, Marshal Blücher's horse was shot from under him, and he was pinned beneath it only to be saved by his aide-de-camp when French cavalry charged past, failing to spot the entangled marshal in the fading light. Imagine being trapped under a dead horse as an entire cavalry charge thunders over you. The battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras set the stage for the climactic showdown. Napoleon had succeeded in defeating one enemy but not destroying them, and the other had held its ground. The two Allied armies, though separated, were still poised to unite, setting the stage for the decisive battle that would follow just 2 days later. The air hung heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the grim anticipation of a final reckoning. You've just witnessed the brutal, inconclusive opening acts of Ligny and Quatre Bras, where Napoleon attempted to divide and conquer his enemies, but only managed to wound one. Now imagine the tension of June 17, 1815, as both armies regrouped and repositioned, the air thick with anticipation. Wellington, having held Quatre Bras skillfully, withdrew his army north to a carefully chosen defensive position near the village of Waterloo. This was to be the stage for the climactic battle, the final act in Napoleon's extraordinary career, a contest that would decide the fate of Europe and etch itself into legend. The battlefield at Waterloo was a gentle, undulating ridge offering Wellington good defensive ground, with a reverse slope that could conceal his troops from French artillery. Key strong points like the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte and the chateau of Hougoumont provided natural fortifications. You can picture Wellington calm and calculating, surveying the terrain, knowing that his Anglo-Allied army, a mix of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, needed to hold long enough for Blücher's Prussians to arrive. He famously remarked, "I pray to God that Blücher may come up." On the morning of June 18, 1815, a heavy rain soaked the battlefield, delaying Napoleon's attack. This delay, while frustrating for Napoleon, actually helped Wellington by softening the ground, making French cavalry and artillery less effective. Imagine the muddy fields, the damp uniforms, the shivering soldiers awaiting the dawn of battle. The battle began around 11:30 a.m. with a massive French assault on Hougoumont, a diversionary attack that turned into a prolonged, brutal struggle for control of the fortified farm. What followed was a day of relentless French attacks and stubborn Allied defense. Massed French columns supported by intense artillery fire repeatedly assaulted Wellington's main line. The famous British squares, impenetrable formations of infantry, bravely withstood wave after wave of French cavalry, charges their bayonets bristling like porcupines. You can almost hear the roar of the cannons, the thundering hooves of the cavalry, and the defiant shouts of the British redcoats as they held their ground. Marshal Ney, in particular, led several ill-fated premature cavalry charges, exhausting his forces. The pivotal moment arrived in the late afternoon, as Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard in a final desperate push against the British center, the Prussians having force-marched for hours after their defeat at Ligny. Remember that defeat from Part 25 finally began to arrive on Napoleon's eastern flank. Their appearance shattered French morale and stretched Napoleon's already thin lines. One authoritative historical fact is that the timely arrival of the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher in the late afternoon of June 18, 1815, played a critical role in turning the tide of the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon. The sight of the Prussians, combined with the unwavering resolve of Wellington's battered but unbroken line, led to the final collapse of the French army. The Imperial Guard famously made a desperate last stand, refusing to surrender. Napoleon, realizing all was lost, fled the field. Historians still debate the single most critical factor in Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Was it Ney's tactical blunders, Napoleon's ill health or overconfidence, Wellington's defensive genius, or the sheer resilience and timely arrival of the Prussians? It's like trying to pick the single thread that caused a tapestry to unravel. A quirky fact: the morning of the battle, Wellington reportedly ate a cold meat pie for breakfast, a stark contrast to the momentous events that were about to unfold. Imagine facing the most famous general in history on the battlefield, having just had a rather bland pie. Waterloo was the ultimate decisive defeat, bringing an end to Napoleon's dream of empire and marking the final bloody conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. The thunderous roar of the cannons at Waterloo finally silenced the ambition of the man who had reshaped Europe. You've stood on the muddy, blood-soaked fields of Waterloo, witnessing the final crushing defeat that ended Napoleon's audacious 100 Days. Imagine the scene in Paris in the immediate aftermath, a city reeling from the news, the brief euphoria of Napoleon's return replaced by grim reality. For the second time in little over a year, Napoleon found himself faced with the inescapable truth that his reign was over. This led to his second abdication, a less dramatic but equally poignant end to his political career. Having fled the battlefield, Napoleon returned to Paris on June 21, 1815, still clinging to the hope of rallying support and continuing the fight. He proposed raising a new army, perhaps even leading a popular uprising. But the political will, both in the legislative chambers and among his former allies, had evaporated. His marshals and politicians, led by figures like Joseph Fouché, his former police minister, now a pragmatist if ever there was one, made it clear that further resistance was futile and would only lead to more bloodshed and a harsher peace for France. You can almost hear the weary arguments, the desperate pleas for him to see reason, the final closing of doors on his boundless ambition. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist when cornered, understood the message. He knew that if he clung to power, the Allies would march directly on Paris once more and likely impose even more punitive terms on France. To save his nation from further devastation, and perhaps with a lingering hope for his son Napoleon II to succeed him, he formally abdicated for the second and final time on June 22, 1815. This abdication was again made in favor of his son, but the Allies had no intention of allowing a Bonaparte dynasty to continue. The provisional government in Paris quickly moved to secure peace with the coalition powers, effectively ignoring Napoleon's proposed succession. Louis XVI, the Bourbon monarch who had fled just weeks earlier, was swiftly restored to the throne. It was a rapid, almost anticlimactic end to the tumultuous 100 Days. Imagine the relief across Europe, a collective sigh as the Corsican ogre was finally truly removed from power. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon's second abdication on June 22, 1815, was driven by the political and military impossibility of continuing the war after Waterloo, leading to the second restoration of Louis XVI. Napoleon lingered in France for a few weeks, briefly considering escaping to America, but the British Royal Navy had effectively blockaded the ports, making any such attempt impossible. Faced with capture by his enemies, he famously surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon on July 15, 1815, hoping that the British, known for their sense of fair play, would grant him asylum, or at least a comfortable exile. Historians still debate whether Napoleon genuinely believed the British would treat him leniently, or if his surrender was a desperate gamble born of limited options. Was it naive hope? Or calculated risk? A quirky fact: when Napoleon boarded HMS Bellerophon, he famously declared, "I come to place myself under the protection of your laws," perhaps attempting to appeal to British legal traditions. Imagine the irony of the man who had overturned so many laws, now seeking protection under his enemies. The second abdication was a less dramatic, but profoundly more definitive end to Napoleon's direct political involvement. The stage was now set for his permanent removal from Europe, ensuring that his influence, at least in person, would never again threaten the continent's fragile peace. His incredible journey from obscure Corsican officer to Emperor of Europe was finally at its close. You've just witnessed Napoleon's second and final abdication, a quiet surrender that sealed his fate. Now imagine a vast, unyielding ocean and at its heart a tiny volcanic speck of land thousands of miles from Europe. This was to be Napoleon's final destination, a prison without walls that would contain the greatest conqueror of his age, his exile to St. Helena. For the Allied powers, particularly Britain, it was imperative that Napoleon never again pose a threat to Europe's hard-won peace. After his surrender, Napoleon was initially held aboard HMS Bellerophon, while the Allied powers debated his fate. They quickly decided against allowing him to go to America, or, indeed, anywhere else within striking distance of Europe. The memories of the 100 Days were too fresh, the risk of another dramatic return too great. Their chosen solution was St. Helena, a remote British island in the South Atlantic notorious for its isolation and its strong winds making escape virtually impossible. It was the ultimate maximum security prison designed by nature itself. You can almost feel the chilling finality of that decision, sealing away a titan on a distant rock. On August 7, 1815, Napoleon was transferred to HMS Northumberland for the long voyage to St. Helena. He arrived on the island in October 1815 and would spend the remaining 6 years of his life there. Imagine the drastic change from the imperial palaces of Europe, from commanding vast armies to living in a relatively modest house, Longwood House, constantly under British guard. His life became a monotonous routine, constantly observed a gilded cage on a barren island. The conditions warm of his exile were a source of constant complaint for Napoleon and his small retinue of loyal followers. He was subjected to strict surveillance with guards posted around his residence and patrols constantly circling the island. His correspondence was intercepted and visitors were few and heavily vetted. He complained bitterly about the climate, the food, and the perceived indignities inflicted upon him by the British governor Sir Hudson Lowe, whom he loathed. Historians still debate the extent to which Napoleon's complaints about his treatment on St. Helena were genuine grievances or a deliberate attempt to cultivate an image of martyrdom for posterity. Was he truly suffering or playing to a future audience? Probably a bit of both, knowing Napoleon. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon's confinement on St. Helena was overseen by a large British military garrison, ensuring no possibility of escape and making it one of the most secure prisons of its time. Despite his constant protests, Napoleon spent his time dictating his memoirs, corresponding with sympathizers when allowed, and entertaining his small household. He reflected on his past campaigns, his legal reforms, and his political philosophy, attempting to craft his own historical narrative for future generations. He became, in a sense, a captive chronicler of his own epic life. A quirky fact: Napoleon reportedly spent hours playing billiards during his exile, sometimes even using the cues to poke holes in the maps of Europe, perhaps still dreaming of grand campaigns. Imagine the conqueror of Europe reduced to frustrated map poking. Napoleon died on St. Helena on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, officially from stomach cancer, though speculation about poisoning persisted for years. His final exile was not just a physical imprisonment. It was a symbolic act removing the disruptive force that had dominated Europe for 2 decades. The remote windswept island of St. Helena became a silent monument to the end of an era, finally bringing a definitive close to the tumultuous story of Napoleon and the wars that bore his name. You've just witnessed Napoleon's final quiet moments on the remote island of St. Helena, a lonely end for a man who once commanded an empire. But even in death, Napoleon's influence lingered, particularly in the nation he shaped and reshaped so profoundly. Imagine France in the years and decades after his passing, a country grappling with its identity, oscillating between monarchy and republic, yet forever bearing the indelible mark of the emperor. This is the enduring legacy in France. A complex tapestry woven from legal codes, administrative structures, and a powerful, almost mythical national identity. First and foremost, the Corsican Napoleonic Code. Remember that masterpiece from Part 6 remains the bedrock of French civil law to this day. Its principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, and a clear secular legal framework have endured successive revolutions and regimes. Imagine a legal system so robust, so logical, that it survives the very empire that birthed it, a testament to its fundamental utility. Even if you don't realize it, if you're interacting with French law, you're interacting with Napoleon's vision. Beyond the legal system, Napoleon's administrative reforms fundamentally centralized and modernized the French state. He created the prefect system, appointing prefects governors to administer each department, ensuring uniform governance across the nation. He established the Bank of France, stabilizing the nation's finances. He reformed the education system, creating the lycée system of secondary schools and emphasizing meritocracy. You can almost see the meticulous organizational charts, the carefully designed institutions, all built to make France a more efficient and powerful state. One authoritative historical fact is that many of the administrative and legal structures established by Napoleon, most notably the civil code and the prefectural system, are still in place in France today. Napoleon also reconciled the state with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, recall, Part 5, bringing an end to the bitter religious divisions of the Revolution. While he kept the church under state control, this pragmatic move healed a deep rift in French society, allowing for religious peace and reintegration. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's enduring administrative and legal reforms were his greatest positive contribution to France, or if they ultimately laid the groundwork for an overly centralized state that stifled local initiative. Was he a modernizer or a centralizing autocrat? Probably a bit of both. Perhaps most profoundly, Napoleon bequeathed to France a powerful, albeit complicated, national identity. He created a mythology of glory, of military prowess, and of a nation at the center of Europe. The Arc de Triomphe, the Vendôme column, his grand funeral procession to Les Invalides in 1840, all served to immortalize his image and reinforce this narrative. Imagine Parisians gazing up at these monumental tributes, remembering a time when France dominated the continent. A quirky fact: Napoleon introduced the metric system throughout his empire, solidifying its adoption in France and spreading it across Europe, making it one of his least controversial but most globally impactful legacies. So next time you measure something in meters, you can thank Napoleon. Even today, Napoleon remains a figure of immense debate and fascination in France. He is celebrated by some as a national hero who restored order and glory, and condemned by others as a dictator who plunged Europe into endless war and suppressed liberties. This complex, enduring legacy ensures that the shadow of Napoleon continues to loom large over France, a permanent fixture in its historical memory and national consciousness, proving that some figures, even after death, continue to fight their battles for remembrance and interpretation. You've explored Napoleon's complex and enduring legacy within France itself, a blend of legal bedrock and national myth. But the emperor's influence was never confined to his homeland. Imagine the vast tapestry of Europe, a collection of disparate kingdoms, empires, and states, suddenly subjected to French conquest, occupation, and the imposition of new ideas and systems. The impact on Europe of the Napoleonic Wars was profound and multifaceted, reshaping nations, redrawing borders, and planting the seeds of future conflicts and transformations that would unfold for decades, even centuries after his final defeat. Napoleon's conquests, while brutal, inadvertently served as a powerful catalyst for change across the continent. He systematically dismantled old, inefficient feudal structures wherever his armies went. The Napoleonic Code, which you'll recall from Part 6 and 29, was introduced in many conquered territories, sweeping away archaic laws, promoting equality before the law, and secularizing institutions. Imagine the shock, and often the grudging admiration, as ancient aristocratic privileges were abolished and commoners found themselves with new legal rights. This was a direct, often forceful export of revolutionary principles, even if under an imperial banner. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose collection of hundreds of German states, was finally dissolved by Napoleon in 1806, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine, a French client state. This dramatic consolidation, though imposed inadvertently, set the stage for later German unification. Similarly, in Italy, Napoleon abolished numerous small states and created larger, more consolidated kingdoms, fostering a nascent sense of Italian identity that would eventually lead to unification in the mid-19th century. You can almost see the ancient jumbled maps being torn up and redrawn with bolder, simpler lines. However, the impact was not solely progressive. The incessant warfare led to immense destruction, loss of life, and economic disruption across Europe. Cities were plundered, Economies were strained by requisitions, and millions of lives were lost both in battle and from disease and famine. Imagine the widespread devastation, the countless families torn apart, the vast resources consumed by perpetual conflict. One authoritative historical fact is that the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815 are estimated to have caused between 3.5 and 7 million deaths, making them one of the deadliest conflicts in human history up to that point. The redrawing of the map at the Congress of Vienna, remember Part 23, was an attempt to restore balance and legitimacy, but it often ignored local populations' desires, planting new seeds of resentment. For example, the creation of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands uniting Catholic Belgians with Protestant Dutch, or the division of Poland among the great powers created artificial entities that would lead to future nationalist uprisings. Historians still debate whether the ultimate impact of the Napoleonic Wars on Europe was one of modernization and progress through destruction of the old order, or one of immense suffering and a reinforcement of conservative authoritarianism in the immediate aftermath. Was it a destructive force for good or just destructive? A quirky fact: during the occupation of German states, some French soldiers introduced the concept of the Fête impériale, imperial festival, which included grand parades and public celebrations, a stark contrast to the often somber local traditions, but also a way to subtly impose French culture. Imagine being forced to celebrate your conqueror's birthday with fireworks and parades. The Napoleonic Wars, therefore, were far more than just military campaigns. They were a cataclysmic force that reshaped the political, social, and economic landscape of Europe, leaving behind a legacy of both reform and reaction, and irrevocably altering the trajectory of nations for generations to come. You've just considered the profound, often contradictory impact of the Napoleonic Wars on the political and social fabric of Europe. Now let's zoom in on one of the most powerful and unforeseen consequences of Napoleon's conquests: the emergence and dramatic acceleration of nationalism. Imagine a continent where loyalty was primarily owed to a local lord, a monarch, or a specific dynasty, where the concept of a shared nation as a cohesive identity was nascent at best. Then picture the imposition of foreign rule, the shared experience of resistance, and the awakening of a collective sense of us versus them. Before Napoleon, Europe was largely a patchwork of dynastic states. People identified more with their village, their region, or their monarch than with a broader German or Italian identity. The French Revolution introduced the radical idea of la grande nation, a people united by common language, culture, and shared civic ideals. Napoleon, while suppressing liberal freedoms at home, paradoxically spread this idea of national identity through his conquests. By overthrowing old regimes and imposing French administration, he inadvertently provoked a fierce backlash, forcing occupied peoples to define themselves in opposition to their French rulers. Consider the German states. For centuries, they had been a fragmented collection of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities. Napoleon's dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, remember that from Part 30, and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, while consolidating territories, also sparked a profound sense of shared grievance and cultural unity. Imagine Prussians, Bavarians, and Saxons, once rivals, now finding common ground in their hatred of the French occupation and a shared desire for Germany. Poets, philosophers, and intellectuals began to articulate a distinct German spirit, language, and history. This was the awakening of German nationalism, a powerful force that would eventually lead to unification later in the 19th century. Similarly, in Italy, Napoleon's reorganization of the peninsula into larger French-dominated kingdoms, despite being under foreign control, fostered a sense of a common Italian identity that transcended regional loyalties. The French occupation inadvertently provided a common enemy and a shared aspiration for a unified Italian state. You can almost hear the quiet, fervent discussions in taverns and salons about Italia as a single sovereign entity. One authoritative historical fact is that Napoleon's reorganization of the German states directly contributed to the rise of German nationalism, which was a key factor in later German unification. However, historians still debate whether Napoleon's impact on nationalism was primarily a positive force for self-determination or a negative catalyst for aggressive exclusionary ideologies that would lead to future conflicts. Was he a reluctant father of modern nation-states, or a destructive force that unleashed dangerous passions? It's a complex, thorny question. The Napoleonic Wars also inspired a surge of patriotism and national pride in nations that successfully resisted him, most notably Great Britain and Russia. The spirit of 1812 in Russia, for instance, became a powerful national myth celebrating Russian resilience and unity against the invaders. Even in Spain, the brutal Peninsular War, remember Part 12, forged a powerful sense of national identity through guerrilla resistance. A quirky fact: during the Peninsular War, Spanish patriots would sometimes print crude satirical pamphlets and caricatures of Napoleon, distributing them secretly to bolster morale and mock the French occupation. Imagine seeing a cartoon of your despised conqueror passed hand to hand in secret. The unintended consequence of Napoleon's imperial ambitions was thus the powerful unleashing of nationalist sentiments across Europe, a force that would both unify disparate peoples and ignite new conflicts, forever altering the political landscape far beyond the terms of any treaty. You've explored the profound rise of nationalism, an unforeseen consequence of Napoleon's conquests that reshaped European identities. Now let's widen our lens one last time, extending beyond the battlefields and palaces of Europe to consider the global consequences of the Napoleonic era. Imagine the world in the early 19th century: vast colonial empires, burgeoning trade networks, and simmering geopolitical tensions. The wars that raged in Europe were not isolated events. Their tremors were felt across oceans, impacting distant colonies, shaping emerging nations, and accelerating shifts in global power that would resonate for generations. Perhaps the most direct global consequence was the transfer of colonial territories and the disruption of established trade routes. Great Britain, with its undisputed naval supremacy secured at Trafalgar, remember Part 10, was able to seize numerous French, Dutch, and Spanish colonies throughout the wars, including territories in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Imagine the vast British Empire, already dominant, growing even larger and more secure as a direct result of Europe's conflicts. This strengthened Britain's global economic and strategic position, solidifying its role as the dominant world power for the next century. Conversely, the Napoleonic Wars led to the independence of vast swathes of Latin America. Spain, occupied by Napoleon's forces, and with its legitimate monarchy deposed, recall Part 12, lost control over its American colonies. The power vacuum and the weakening of Spanish authority allowed independence movements which had been simmering for decades to erupt and flourish. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín seized the opportunity, leading successful rebellions that resulted in the creation of numerous independent Latin American republics. You can almost hear the distant cheers of newfound freedom across the Atlantic, a direct ripple effect of Napoleon's European ambitions. The wars also influenced the United States. The ongoing naval blockades, the continental system from Part 11, and the British counter-blockade severely impacted neutral American shipping, leading to impressment of American sailors and trade disputes. This ultimately contributed to the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. While a relatively minor conflict in the grand scheme of the Napoleonic Wars, it was crucial for forging a stronger American national identity and confirming its independence from European entanglements. Imagine a young America trying to assert its sovereignty, getting caught in the crossfire of European giants. The spread of revolutionary and liberal ideas, even unintentionally, was another global consequence. While the European powers at the Congress of Vienna, remember Part 23, sought to suppress these ideas, the concepts of national sovereignty, popular rights, and republicanism carried by French armies, or sparked by resistance to them, found fertile ground in various parts of the world, inspiring future movements for self-determination. One authoritative historical fact is that the Napoleonic Wars directly contributed to the independence movements in Latin America by weakening Spain's control over its colonial empire. Historians still debate the extent to which the Napoleonic Wars acted as a true turning point in global history, or if they merely accelerated pre-existing trends of British imperial expansion and Latin American independence. Was Napoleon a catalyst or just a very loud historical blip in larger global shifts? It's like wondering if a single powerful storm created a new coastline or just dramatically reshaped one already eroding. A quirky fact during the Napoleonic Wars, some British merchants resorted to smuggling opium into China to offset trade imbalances caused by the continental system unknowingly laying the groundwork for the later Opium Wars and a significant chapter in East-West relations. Imagine a domino effect across the globe started by a man who never even visited Asia. The Corsican global consequences of the Napoleonic era were therefore far-reaching and complex, a testament to an interconnected world where a single conflict, however concentrated, could send ripples across oceans, shaping empires, igniting revolutions, and ultimately paving the way for the modern world order. Now, as the thunder of cannons fades and the dust settles on our epic journey through the Napoleonic Wars, let the grand strategies, the personal dramas, and the sheer scale of the conflict gently recede into the quiet corners of your mind. Picture the vast sweep of history, how one man's ambition could reshape continents, inspire new nations, and alter the destinies of millions even far beyond the battlefields. The echoes of those turbulent years of empires rising and falling continue to murmur in the quiet moments, reminding us of the enduring power of human will and the ever-shifting tides of fate. As the last image blurs the world forever changed, drifts into a peaceful, timeless hush. Word count 1099 in. End of script. Good night.